She had nothing left but a loaf of bread and enough pride to keep walking. Adeline Mercer arrived at Cross Ridge Ranch on a Tuesday, dust-covered and hollow-eyed, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle she hadn't eaten from in 2 days. Behind her lay a foreclosed farm, a fresh grave, and a string of doors slammed in her face across 40 miles of Montana territory. The man who answered the gate looked at her the way men looked at stray dogs. Not cruel, just tired. But inside that house, a child was too weak from hunger to stand up from the floor. And Adeline had bread. Like and comment the name of your city below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The road that brought her to Cross Ridge had started 6 weeks earlier in the county clerk's office in Billings, where a man in a pressed suit informed Adeline that the farm she and her husband Daniel had worked for 11 years no longer belonged to her. The lien was filed in March, he said, not looking up from his paperwork. You had 60 days. Daniel died in March, she said. The clerk looked up then. He had the decency to appear uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, but the filing date is the filing date. She'd walked out of that office into a wind that smelled like rain that wasn't coming. The farm, all 140 acres of it, gone. The cattle already sold to cover Daniel's medical debts. The house emptied by creditors before she could gather more than a single trunk of belongings. For 3 weeks after that, Adeline stayed with her sister-in-law in Billings, sleeping on a cot near the kitchen stove and trying to figure out what came next. Her sister-in-law, a nervous woman named Patrice who had 4 children of her own and a husband who drank through his paycheck, said the kindest thing she could manage. You can't stay past the end of the month, Addie. I just can't feed another mouth. Adeline understood. She thanked Patrice, packed her trunk, and sold half of what was in it at the dry goods store on Merchant Street for enough cash to buy 3 weeks of food and a pair of boots that actually fit. Then she started walking. Not aimlessly. Adeline had never done anything aimlessly in her life. She had a list of names. 3 ranches east of Billings, where she'd heard through Patrice's neighbor that families were looking for help. A housekeeper, a cook, a woman who could manage a household. Adeline could do all 3 and do them well. She'd run Daniel's farm nearly alone during the last 2 years of his sickness, keeping the accounts, managing the hired hands, canning enough food in late summer to last through the worst of winter. She knew how to work. She just needed someone willing to give her the chance. The first name on her list was a rancher named Hollis, north of Roundup. She walked 11 miles and arrived to find his wife standing on the porch, arms folded, eyes sharp as flint. We already have a girl, the woman said before Adeline had finished introducing herself. I'm not a girl, Adeline said. I'm 34 years old and I can run your kitchen, your accounts, and your garden. We have a girl, the woman repeated, and went back inside. The second name was a sheep farmer named Crab, another 9 miles south. He came to the door himself, looked Adeline up and down in a way that made her grip the handle of her trunk harder, and said he might have a use for her. And he said it with a particular kind of smile that told her exactly what kind of use he meant. She turned around and walked back down his drive without a word. The third name was a widow outside of a small settlement called Garrison, who had written to Patrice's neighbor asking for a companion. But when Adeline arrived, she found the woman had died 2 weeks prior, and her son, a sharp-featured man in his 30s, told her that no, he didn't need anyone, and could she please get off his property. That night, Adeline slept in a dry creek bed wrapped in her coat and stared at the stars and had a long, honest conversation with herself about what she was willing to do and what she was not. She was not willing to beg. She was not willing to sell herself in any form. She was not willing to give up. That left walking, and so she walked. She'd heard about Cross Ridge Ranch from an old Blackfoot woman selling dried herbs at the edge of a trading post near the Musselshell River. Adeline had stopped to buy a bundle of dried sage with the last 2 pennies she felt she could spare, and the woman, who introduced herself as Nothing, which Adeline respected, had looked at her with the particular directness of someone who has seen a great deal of the world and wastes no time with pretense. You're looking for work, the woman said. It wasn't a question. I am. Cross Ridge Ranch, Wyatt Ashcroft, about 8 miles northeast from here, follows the river bend. The woman tied the sage into a neater bundle and handed it back. His wife died 14 months ago. He's got 4 children and he's drowning. Does he need help? The woman's expression was unreadable. What he needs and what he'll admit to are 2 different things, but those children need somebody. Adeline asked how much she owed for the sage. Consider it an investment, the woman said, and turned back to her herbs. 8 miles northeast. Adeline made it in a day and a half, sleeping one night against the base of a cottonwood tree when the light gave out, eating the last half of the loaf of bread she'd baked 3 days earlier at Patrice's kitchen before she left Billings. She'd baked it herself. Dark rye bread with a little molasses stirred in, the way her mother had taught her. Dense and filling and still faintly good, even when it was 2 days old. She'd wrapped it in a clean cloth and carried it in her bag like it was something valuable, because it was. It was the last food she had. She saved half of it. She didn't fully understand why at the time. Maybe she just wasn't hungry enough yet. Maybe something in her, the part that had survived 11 years of frontier farming and 2 years of watching her husband die slowly and 6 weeks of being turned away, knew enough to hold something in reserve. By the time she reached Cross Ridge Ranch on that Tuesday afternoon, she was hungry enough that the half loaf felt like a stone in her bag, heavy with everything she wanted to do with it. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected. Set back from a creek bend, the main house was 2 stories of weathered timber with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There were outbuildings, a barn, 2 smaller structures that might have been a smokehouse and a tool shed, a chicken coop listing slightly to the left, as if it had been leaning that way for years and everyone had decided to accept it. A split-rail fence ran the perimeter of what had been a kitchen garden, now choked with weeds. Somebody had started a repair on the front gate and hadn't finished. Half the gate hung straight, the other half angled outward like an elbow, held in place by a single hinge. The place had the specific look of somewhere that had once been well tended and was losing the battle to stay that way. Adeline stood at the half-open gate for a moment and took it all in. Then she walked up the path and knocked on the door. The man who answered was tall, not dramatically so, but he had the kind of height that comes with work, built into the shoulders and the stance. He looked like he'd once been broader across the chest. Now he was lean in a way that suggested he'd been missing meals or forgetting to eat them, which were different problems with the same result. His hair was dark and unwashed, his jaw carrying about 4 days of uneven stubble. He was wearing a shirt that had been mended at the left elbow with thread of a slightly different color, which told Adeline that he'd done the mending himself or had a child do it. His eyes were the color of creek water in late summer, gray-green and tired. Not unfriendly, just very, very tired. He looked at her the way people look at problems they don't have the energy to deal with. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was level, not unkind. "I'm looking for Wyatt Ashcroft," Adeline said. "That's me. My name is Adeline Mercer. I've been told you might need help with your household." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a flinch, but close. "Who told you that?" "A woman near the Mussel Shell trading post. I didn't get her name." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, from somewhere in the house, Adeline heard a child's voice. Older, a girl, saying something she couldn't make out. And then a sound she recognized immediately. A small child crying, the particular thin cry of a child who is weak and hungry rather than simply upset. Wyatt Ashcroft's jaw tightened. He didn't turn around. "We're managing fine," he said. Adeline reached into her bag and brought out the cloth-wrapped bread. "I'm not here to ask for charity, Mr. Ashcroft. I'm asking for a drink of water. In exchange," she held up the bread, "I'm offering this." He stared at the bread. "Rye bread," she said. "Made 3 days ago. Still good." "I can see what it is." "Then you can see it's worth a cup of water." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching. She'd had practice at this, at standing still under scrutiny and not letting her face show what her legs were doing, which was trembling slightly after a day and a half of walking. "I'm not going to take your bread for a cup of water," he said finally. "Then consider it a trade for 5 minutes of conversation about whether you might have use for a housekeeper and cook." "We're managing fine," she said. "You said, but that child crying inside doesn't sound fine to me." His expression did something complicated. His hand on the doorframe tightened. For a moment, she genuinely didn't know which way it would go, whether he'd close the door or open it. He opened it. "Come in," he said. "I'll get you the water." The kitchen was the first room she saw, and it told her most of what she needed to know. The stove was cold, Not just unlit for the day, cold in the way that suggested it hadn't been properly stoked in a while. The kind of deep cold that settles into iron when it's been neglected. The table had the remains of a meal on it that appeared to be cold beans from a can and some crackers that had been left open long enough to go soft. There were dishes in a basin that had been started toward clean and then abandoned. A pot hung from a hook by the stove with something dried and stuck to the bottom. Sitting at the table was a girl of about 13, straight-backed and watchful, with dark eyes that took in Adeline's arrival with the measuring look of someone who'd had to assess strangers quickly and had learned not to trust them cheaply. She had Wyatt's coloring, dark hair pulled back with a piece of twine, and she was wearing an apron that was too big for her, the strings wrapped twice around her narrow waist. Across the room, on a low cot near the wall, lay a child of about 4, a boy, thin-limbed and pale, with 2 bright patches of color on his cheekbones that Adeline recognized as the particular flush of a child who hasn't eaten enough and has been crying. 2 more children were somewhere else in the house. Adeline could hear them. The girl at the table stood up when Adeline came in, putting herself between Adeline and the boy on the cot, with the automatic instinct of someone who'd been doing that for a while. "Who's this?" she said to her father. "A woman looking for work," Wyatt said. He went to the water bucket, filled a tin cup, and brought it to Adeline. "This is Clara, my oldest." "I can speak for myself," Clara said, still watching Adeline. "I know you can," Wyatt said quietly. Adeline drank the water. It was cold and tasted faintly of the creek, clean and mineral, and she made herself drink it slowly even though her body wanted to tip the entire cup back at once. "Thank you," she said, and set the cup down on the table. Then she unwrapped the bread and set that down too. "This is for the children." Clara's eyes went to the bread. The wanting on her face was naked and immediate before she got it controlled again, and something in Adeline's chest ached at that. At a 13-year-old girl who'd already learned to hide her hunger. "We don't take charity," Clara said. "It's not charity. It's a trade. I got water. I gave bread. That's commerce." Clara looked at her father. Wyatt was looking at the bread. Then he looked at the boy on the cot. Something in his face shifted. Some wall that had been holding came down, just slightly, just enough. "Robbie," he said to the boy, "come eat something." Tassa. There were 4 children. Clara was 13 and had been running the household, or attempting to, since her mother Eleanor had died 14 months ago from a fever that came on fast and didn't give them time to prepare. She was the kind of 13 that comes from being given too much too soon, competent and brittle and exhausted in a way no child should be. Thomas was 10, currently somewhere in the barn doing something Wyatt described as keeping himself busy, which Adeline translated as a child finding reasons to be anywhere except the sad, quiet house. When he came in for the bread, he was all elbows and wary silences, with the kind of eyes that watched doorways. Lily was 7, small for her age with her mother's coloring apparently, lighter than the others, with reddish-brown hair in 2 ragged braids that someone had made an effort with but hadn't quite managed. She attached herself to the chair across from Adeline with the unselfconscious curiosity of a child young enough to not yet know how to hide what she was feeling. And Robbie was 4, too thin, with his father's gray-green eyes and a face that was still baby-round in the way that made the hollows under his cheekbones more alarming by contrast. He ate 2 pieces of the bread without stopping and then fell asleep sitting up at the table with crumbs on his chin. Adeline watched all of this from the chair Wyatt had told her she could take. She watched and said very little, which was intentional. She'd learned a long time ago that you learn more by listening in the first hour than by talking. What she learned was this. The kitchen was cold because Clara had been trying to manage the firewood and the stove and the cooking and the cleaning and the younger children all at once. And something had to give, and today it had been the stove. The beans from a can had been because there wasn't anything else ready, and Clara hadn't had time to start anything before Robbie started crying. And when Robbie cried, it undid everything because he was the youngest, and he'd been sick last month, and everyone in this family was terrified of losing him the way they'd lost Eleanor. The accounts were in disarray. Adeline could see that from the stack of papers on the corner of the table, the kind of organized-looking pile that is actually a disaster when you look at it closely, which she did while Wyatt was briefly outside. The ranch itself appeared to be functional, barely. Wyatt had 2 hired hands. She heard Wyatt mention this to Clara, But she could see from the look of things that 2 hands for a place this size was half of what was needed. And Wyatt himself was a man who had been holding everything together with both hands for 14 months and was so tired he could barely stand up straight, but who would apparently rather crack in half than admit it. She understood that. She understood it specifically, the way you understand things you have lived through yourself. Heavyset. After the bread was finished and Robbie was sleeping and Lily had drifted back to whatever she'd been doing before, Wyatt sat down across the table from Adeline and looked at her with those tired gray-green eyes. "What are your terms?" he said. Adeline had thought about this during the walk. She thought about it carefully because she knew that her terms would tell him what she thought of herself, and she needed him to take her seriously. "Room and board," she said. "A private sleeping space, whatever you have available. 3 meals a day. In exchange for managing your kitchen, your household accounts, and whatever cooking and cleaning the family needs. On a trial basis, 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, you decide whether you want to continue the arrangement. If you do, we discuss wage." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You said managing the accounts." "I kept the accounts on my husband's farm for 11 years. I know how to read a ledger and where to look for problems." "What happened to the farm?" She met his eyes. "My husband died. Creditors filed a lien in March while I was managing his illness. I missed the response window." He absorbed that. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it in the way of someone who actually meant it. "So am I," Adeline said. "But being sorry about the past doesn't put food in your son's stomach, Mr. Ashcroft." Something moved in his expression. It might have been the beginning of something like respect. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she agreed. Clara was the problem. Not in a malicious way. Adeline understood it immediately and completely. Clara had been the woman of this house for 14 months. She had poured herself into it, at enormous cost to her childhood and her sleep and her peace of mind, and she had done it imperfectly and desperately and with everything she had, because she loved her family and she was terrified that if she stopped, everything would fall apart. Now a stranger had walked through the door, and her father had let her in, and that stranger was clearly about to make the kitchen functional and the household organized and the accounts make sense, and all of that was going to look like a very specific kind of comment on the past 14 months. Adeline knew this. So when Clara appeared at the kitchen doorway that first evening and found Adeline crouched in front of the stove, cleaning out the ash and relaying the wood in the grate, she waited for whatever was coming. "That's my job," Claire said. Adeline sat back on her heels and looked at the girl. "Then come teach me how you do it," she said. "I don't know your stove yet. Every stove is different." Clara stared at her. This was not the response she'd prepared for. "The flue stick's on the left," Clara said after a moment, coming into the kitchen slowly. "You have to push it up before you can turn it, or it binds." "Show me," Clara showed her. It was a small thing. But Adeline understood that the way you establish yourself in someone else's house is not by taking over. It's by asking to be taught. Clara was 13 and had been forced into the role of household manager before she was ready, and she had knowledge that was real and specific and hard-earned. And the worst thing Adeline could do was walk in and ignore it. By the time the fire was lit and the kitchen was starting to warm, they were working side by side with a silence that was less hostile than it had been 20 minutes ago. "What are you going to cook?" Clara asked. "What do you have?" Clara walked her through the larder. The situation was worse than Adeline had initially assessed. The pantry had some dried beans, a partial sack of cornmeal, salt, a small amount of lard, some withered root vegetables that had been stored since fall and were past their best, 2 jars of preserved tomatoes, and a little flour. No meat, no eggs. The chickens, Clara said, had mostly stopped laying since winter, and only 2 were still producing. A little milk from the 1 dairy cow, not much. "All right," Adeline said, studying the shelves with the same expression she'd once used on Daniel's farm books when they were in trouble. Assessing, finding what she had to work with. "Cornmeal porridge tonight for the younger ones, bean soup for the rest. Tomorrow I'll need to take an inventory, and we'll make a list of what needs to be bought in town." "We don't have much money," Claire said. Flatly, without embarrassment, just information. "I know," Adeline said. "We'll be careful with what we spend." Clara watched her begin the cornmeal porridge. Measure, water, stir, low heat. and something in the girl's shoulders came down slightly, just a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but something like relief at not being the only one responsible for it all. By the time Wyatt came in from the outbuildings at dusk, the kitchen was warm. Something was actually cooking on the stove, and all four of his children were seated at the table in a configuration that hadn't happened at mealtimes in a long time. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it, and Adeline, who was at the stove and had her back to him, heard him stop and was careful not to turn around right away. "Dinner in 10 minutes," she said. "Wash up." He washed up. It wasn't a grand meal. Cornmeal porridge for the little ones, bean soup with dried herbs for the rest, cornbread made with the last of the reasonable lard, flat and a little uneven because the oven ran hotter on the left side than the right, which Clara had mentioned and Adeline had not fully accounted for. "Flat on one end," Thomas observed, examining his piece of cornbread with the forensic interest of a 10-year-old boy. "Thomas," his father said. "It's all right," Adeline said. "It's flat because I don't know the oven yet. Clara told me about the hot side. I didn't adjust enough. Next time I will." Thomas looked at her with what appeared to be mildly increased interest. This was apparently not the expected response from an adult to criticism. "It still tastes fine," Lily offered helpfully. "Lily is right," Adeline said. "Flat bread tastes the same as round bread. I'll do better when I've learned the stove." Robbie, who had woken from his nap and been brought to the table by Clara with his hair hastily smoothed, ate his entire bowl of porridge and half of another and then looked at Adeline with his father's gray-green eyes. "Are you staying?" he asked. "Robbie," Clara said. "For 2 weeks at least," Adeline said. "After that, we'll see." Robbie considered this with great seriousness. "Okay," he said, and went back to his porridge. Chet. After the children were settled and the kitchen was cleaned, Adeline insisting on this over Clara's exhausted offer to help, telling the girl to go sleep before she fell over, which Clara resisted, but not for very long. Adeline sat down at the kitchen table with the stack of papers she'd noticed earlier. The accounts. She'd asked Wyatt's permission before sitting down with them, and he'd given it, though she could see it cost him something. Some pride, some privacy. He'd sat down across from her with a cup of coffee, real coffee, which surprised her. She hadn't expected that, and watched her begin. She worked through the pages methodically. She'd done this before on the farm, and she had a way of reading accounts that was neither slow nor hasty. She moved through the numbers looking for patterns, inconsistencies, things that didn't line up. The first thing she found was that the Crossridge accounts were behind, but not disastrously so. Wyatt had been managing, barely, by selling cattle in the fall and using the proceeds to cover the most pressing debts. The hired hands were paid modestly, but regularly. The supply accounts at the general store in the nearest town were in arrears, but not catastrophically. The second thing she found was more troubling. There was a land assessment notice from 6 weeks ago, filed by the county. She almost missed it. It had been buried under a seed catalog and a letter from Eleanor's sister that had probably gone unread. The assessment referenced a property survey conducted in February and a boundary dispute filed by a party named Harlan Croft. She looked at the name, Harlan Croft. She didn't know it, but it had the look of a name that appeared in more than one place in these papers. She went back through everything more slowly, looking specifically. Yes, Harlan Croft's name appeared 3 times in the accounts, once on a notation about a fence line dispute from 2 years prior, once on a letter that appeared to be a legal communication about water rights, and now on this assessment notice. She set these 3 pieces of paper side by side on the table and looked at them. "Who is Harlan Croft?" she asked. Wyatt, who had been watching her work with the slightly guarded expression of someone who had agreed to let someone look at their accounts, but wasn't sure he felt good about what they might find, shifted in his chair. "Local businessman," he said, "runs the freight operation and a dry goods store in Garrison. Has interests in a few ranches. Has he been disputing your property before?" "The fence line issue was minor. We settled it." "The water rights letter?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "That was 18 months ago. Eleanor was sick. I didn't have time to deal with it properly. I wrote back saying the claim was unfounded, and I didn't hear from him again." Adeline looked at the assessment notice. "You've heard from him now. This survey in February..." I know about it, Wyatt said. My neighbor mentioned it. I figured it was routine. Adeline studied the document more carefully. The language was dense and bureaucratic, the kind of writing designed to be hard to read quickly, but she was patient with it. This isn't routine, she said. What do you mean? She turned the document around and pushed it across the table to him, pointing to a specific clause near the bottom. This references a claim filed under the Land Act provisions, Section 14, which applies to disputed homestead boundaries when a key witness to the original survey is deceased. She paused. Who conducted your original property survey, and when did they die? Wyatt went very still. A man named Aldous Keene, he said slowly. He was a surveyor out of Helena. He did our boundary work when we first established the ranch. He died of, He stopped. Started again. He died last winter, November. Adeline looked at him. Mr. Ashcroft, someone filed this boundary claim in February, 3 months after the surveyor who documented your original property lines died. The silence in the kitchen stretched out. That's not a coincidence, Wyatt said. No, Adeline said. I don't think it is. She looked at the 3 pieces of paper and then at the rest of the stack, and she thought about Harlan Croft filing water rights disputes and fence line disputes and boundary assessments, each one separated by enough time to seem unrelated, each one a small pressure, each one something a man overwhelmed by grief and 4 children and a struggling ranch might not notice adding up. A pattern. I need to see everything you have, she said. Every piece of correspondence that mentions his name, every legal notice, every survey record you can find. Can you do that? Wyatt was looking at the papers on the table with an expression she was beginning to understand. The specific look of a man who has been so deep in surviving from day to day that he hasn't been able to see the shape of what's being done to him. Yes, he said, I can do that. Good, Adeline said. She set the assessment notice carefully to one side and picked up the next paper in the stack. Then let's start tonight. She found a place to sleep that first night in a small room off the kitchen that appeared to have been used for storage. It was full of preserved jars and seed boxes and a butter churn, but had a cot folded against the wall and a small window that looked out toward the creek. Wyatt carried the storage boxes to the barn without being asked, which she noticed. Clara brought her an extra quilt without being asked, which she also noticed. These were small things, but she'd spent 6 weeks learning how to read small things. She lay on the cot in her clothes. It was too cold in the room for anything else, and listened to the ranch settle around her. The wind off the Montana plain was a particular sound, not quite a howl, more like a conversation happening in a language she almost understood. The creek was low enough to hear from the window, a steady murmur. She was still hungry. She'd given herself less soup at dinner than she should have, without being obvious about it, because there hadn't been quite enough for everyone, and Robbie was the priority. Tomorrow she would take stock of what could be salvaged in the kitchen garden. Tomorrow she would look at the supply list and see what could be stretched and what actually had to be purchased. Tomorrow she would ask Wyatt to show her where all the property documents were stored. Tonight she lay in the dark and went over what she'd seen in those accounts, and the name Harlan Croft arranged itself in her mind with the particular significance of something that was going to require her full attention. She didn't know yet exactly what was being done, but she'd worked the books on a failing farm for 2 years, and she knew what a systematic attack on someone's livelihood looked like when she was reading its paper trail. Someone was trying to take this ranch, and they were doing it carefully and slowly, and they had timed it to take advantage of a grieving man who was too overwhelmed to see it clearly. Adeline stared at the ceiling in the dark and made a decision. She had come here looking for 2 weeks of work and a place to sleep. She was not going to leave this family to be robbed. She didn't know what that meant yet in practical terms. She didn't have money or legal training or connections in this territory. What she had was the ability to read accounts, a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, and a particular quality she'd identified in herself during the worst years of Daniel's illness. When things were very bad and the reasonable response was to be afraid, she found that she was primarily angry. She was angry now. She pulled the quilt up and listened to the wind, and somewhere in the house she could hear Robbie making a small sound in his sleep. Not distress, just the unconscious noises of a small child who had eaten enough that night to sleep deeply. And she closed her eyes. 2 weeks. But already she knew she was not going to leave in 2 weeks. The days at Crossridge moved in a rhythm that Adeline imposed not through authority, but through consistency, which was a different thing entirely. She was up before anyone else. Not by much. Wyatt rose early, the habit of a rancher too ingrained to break. But enough that when he came downstairs, the stove was already lit and the coffee was on. He never commented on this. He just sat down with his cup and drank it while she worked, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that two people fall into when they are both too practical to fill empty air with noise. The first week was about learning the house. Every household has its own particular logic. The way things are stored, the shortcuts people have developed, the systems that work, and the ones that only appear to work. Clara had been running this one on instinct and exhaustion, which meant some things were done with surprising efficiency, and others had simply been abandoned because there wasn't enough of her to go around. Adeline learned the stove. She learned that the oven was honest on the right side and treacherous on the left, and that the firebox liked a particular arrangement of wood, not too tightly packed, or it burned hot for 20 minutes and then sulked. She learned that the water bucket needed to be filled twice a day in winter, 3 times in summer, and that the pump at the well had a cough in it when the temperature dropped below freezing, a mechanical complaint that required a specific 3-pump rhythm to coax it past. She learned the children, too, which was the more important education. Thomas, who was 10, had the specific unhappiness of a boy who had too much feeling and no safe place to put it. He spent time in the barn not because he was particularly interested in animals, but because the barn was the one place in the household where he could be miserable without anyone watching. He was prickly about being helped and proud in the way that boys that age are proud, easily wounded, quick to recover, desperately wanting to be taken seriously. Adeline took him seriously. She asked his opinion on things, where the best firewood was stacked, whether the fence on the south side was going to need repair before summer, what he'd noticed about the calf that seemed to be losing weight. He answered in the clipped way of someone waiting to be dismissed, and each time she listened to his answer and acted on it, she could see him recalibrating, adjusting whatever assumption he'd already made about her. Lily was easier in some ways, harder in others. She was 7 and curious, and had an attachment to a specific gray cat named Edmund, who was technically a barn cat, but had long since achieved house cat status through sheer persistence. Lily wanted to talk, which was not a problem in itself. The problem was that she wanted to talk about her mother, not in a grief-stricken way. Or not only that, she wanted to talk about Eleanor the way children talk about people who are important to them. Incidentally, in the middle of other things, referencing her the way you reference anything that is simply part of how the world works. Mama used to add dried apple to the cornbread, she said one morning, watching Adeline at the stove. Do you know how to do that? I do, Adeline said. We'd need to have dried apple on hand. Does your father buy it in town, or did your mother dry it herself? She did it herself, in September. Then in September, we can do the same, if we have a good apple harvest. Lily considered this with great seriousness. Our tree only had 12 apples last year. Clara counted. 12 apples is a start, Adeline said. We can work with 12. This was, apparently, the right answer. Lily climbed into the chair nearest the stove and began a meandering conversation about Eleanor's apple preservation methods, which Adeline listened to with genuine attention because embedded in the anecdotes of a 7-year-old was real information about how this household had once functioned, and she needed that. Clara remained the hardest. Not hostile after the first few days, the hostility had thawed into something more complicated. Clara watched Adeline with those sharp, dark eyes and tracked everything she did with the attention of someone taking notes. She helped when asked, and occasionally helped without being asked, but she held a careful distance, as if she were still deciding something. On the 4th day, Adeline found her in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, standing at the window with a cup of water and the expression of someone who had been awake for a long time. Couldn't sleep? Adeline said. I sleep fine. Adeline looked at the shadows under the girl's eyes and said nothing about them. She started the fire. You've been running this house for 14 months. Somebody had to. Yes, Adeline said, and you did it, under circumstances that would have broken most grown women. Clara was quiet. I'm not here to replace what you did, Adeline said. I'm here because you shouldn't have had to do it alone. The silence stretched. Outside, the dawn was beginning to suggest itself at the edge of the sky, gray and reluctant. "She used to make the cornbread with dried apple," Clara said finally, her voice flat and careful. "Lily told me." "Lily tells everyone everything." "She loved her mother," Adeline said. Clara set down the water cup. "We all did," she said, and walked out of the kitchen, and Adeline let her go. Progress was not linear. She'd known that going in. By the end of the first week, the kitchen was clean, the larder was organized, and she'd established a meal schedule that worked around the ranch's actual rhythms rather than imposing its own. Robbie had color in his face again. Not much, but enough to notice. He'd started following Adeline around the kitchen in the afternoons with the unselfconscious attachment of a 4-year-old who had decided she was trustworthy, which was both gratifying and inconvenient because he was at the age where underfoot was his natural habitat. The accounts were the other thing she worked on in the evenings. Wyatt brought her everything he could find: letters, survey documents, county notices, correspondence with the bank and billings, 2 separate files that Eleanor had apparently kept with meticulous care that had gone untouched since her death. The Eleanor files were organized in a way that told Adeline something about the woman. Careful, precise, with a notation system that was slightly idiosyncratic but entirely logical once you understood it. Working through it all took 4 evenings, with Wyatt sitting across the table and answering questions when she asked them, and otherwise letting her work, which she appreciated. What she found, assembled in full, was worse than she'd suspected from the first night. Harlan Croft had been building this case for 2 years. The fence line dispute, the one Wyatt had dismissed as minor, had actually resulted in a signed agreement that ceded a small strip of land on the northeastern boundary, 40 feet wide, running the length of the property line. Wyatt had signed it because at the time Eleanor was sick, and a legal fight over 40 feet of scrubland seemed like something to resolve quickly and move past. But that strip of land, Adeline realized, now effectively gave Croft access to the creek tributary that ran along the northeastern edge of Cross Ridge. Water rights in Montana territory were not small things. The February survey, the one filed under Section 14, the one Adeline had identified the first night, had used that strip as its baseline. The surveyor Croft had hired had drawn the new boundary from that 40-foot section and had extended it incrementally across terrain that was technically contested because the original surveyor, Aldous Keene, was dead, and his records were in Helena, and nobody had gone to retrieve them. "Do you know where Keene's original survey records are?" Adeline asked. Wyatt rubbed his eyes. It was late, past 10 o'clock, and he had to be up before 5. "Helena, the Territorial Land Office." "Has anyone requested copies?" "I didn't know I needed to." "You need to," Adeline said. "The original survey would show your actual boundary lines, independent of the cession agreement. If Croft's new survey contradicts the original on any point that wasn't covered by the cession, then his claim is fraudulent," Wyatt said. "Potentially. The cession is real, you signed it. But if he's using it to push beyond what you actually agreed to, that's a different matter entirely." Wyatt looked at her across the lamplit table. "You know a lot about land law for a farmer's wife." "Daniel had a boundary dispute with our neighbor in the 3rd year," Adeline said. "I spent a month reading everything I could find about property law in this territory. It turned out our neighbor was wrong and I was right, and Daniel handled the negotiation badly anyway, but I learned a great deal." A small sound that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of Wyatt's mouth. "Did you tell him that? That he handled it badly?" "Several times," Adeline said. "He didn't appreciate it." This time the sound was definitely a laugh. Short, rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while and needed breaking in. He caught it quickly, as if he'd surprised himself. "I need to go to Helena," Adeline said. The laugh died. "Adeline, the Territorial Land Office. I need to see Keene's original survey records and request certified copies. If they show what I think they'll show, you have grounds to contest Croft's claim before the county assessor." "Helena is 60 miles. "I know how far it is." "You've been here 9 days, which means I have 5 days left on the original 2-week arrangement," she said, "unless you're telling me I should consider that arrangement concluded." He looked at her steadily. The lamp between them made shadows of the lines around his eyes, the ones that were too deep for a man of whatever age he was, late 30s, she guessed, lines that came from squinting into Montana sun and carrying too much for too long. I'm telling you that Helena is a hard ride and you'd be going alone, he said. And Croft has people in garrison. If he finds out someone from this ranch is pulling Keen's records, then I won't tell anyone in garrison which ranch I'm from, Adeline said. I'll be a widow from Billings with a legal question, which is entirely true. That's not... He stopped, tried again. It's not safe. Mr. Ashcroft. She set her pencil down. I've spent 6 weeks walking alone across this territory with nothing in my bag but bread and a change of clothes. I've been turned away from doors and slept in creek beds and walked 9 miles to be told by a man with a particular kind of smile that he had a different kind of use in mind for me. Safe is a relative term. She paused. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I intend to do. You can lend me a horse, or I can walk. The silence was long. I'll lend you a horse, he said. She left 2 days later before the household was up, with a bedroll, 3 days of food, the property documents she needed, and a mare named Cass who turned out to have opinions about the pace she was expected to maintain and expressed them through a particular ear-flattening that Adeline eventually learned to negotiate. The road to Helena was not the worst she'd traveled, but it required attention. The weather held for the first day, cold and clear, the kind of March day that looks like winter pretending to be spring, and she made good time, covering nearly 30 miles before the light gave out, and she found a farmstead willing to let her sleep in the barn for 50 cents. The second day brought wind and a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to do, alternating between thin sunshine and sharp sleet that drove sideways off the mountains. Cass did not appreciate the sleet. Adeline kept her head down and rode through it. Helena was larger than she'd expected. A proper territorial capital with streets and commerce, and the specific energy of a place that believed it was important. The land office was on the main street, a government building that smelled of paper and coal smoke and the particular staleness of institutions that have accumulated too many documents. The clerk was a thin young man who appeared to regard public service as a personal inconvenience. Survey records from what year? He said without looking up. The original homestead survey for the Cross Ridge property, Chouteau County, filed by Aldous Keene, approximately 1871 or 1872. Those would be in the Territorial Archive. That's a separate request. I understand I'm making a separate request. He looked up at her. He had the expression of someone assessing whether she was going to be a problem. She looked back at him with the specific blankness of someone who has infinite patience and nowhere else to be. He got up and went into the back. She waited for 40 minutes. She did not pace. She stood at the counter and read the posted notices on the board behind it, and thought about what she was looking for and what she'd do with it once she found it. The clerk came back with a thin file and the manner of someone doing a favor they resent. There are 2 documents here under Keene's name for that property. I can allow you to view them here. Copies are 20 cents a page. I'll take copies of everything, Adeline said. She read the originals first, carefully, standing at the counter because there was no chair offered. The survey was dated 1872. Keene had been precise. His notation was detailed, his measurements recorded in multiple units as was standard practice for contested territory, and his boundary markers were tied to fixed physical landmarks. The creek bend, a specific rock formation on the north ridge, a grove of cottonwood on the eastern line. She found what she was looking for on the 3rd page. The northeastern boundary, the one where the 40-foot strip cession had occurred. In Keene's original survey, the boundary ran 8 feet further north than Croft's February survey indicated, not just past the cession strip, but past the point where Croft's survey claimed the water rights transfer became valid, which meant that even accounting for the signed cession, the boundary Croft's surveyor had drawn was wrong. He'd overclaimed by 8 feet on a 300-foot line. 8 feet didn't sound like much, but 8 feet on a water access claim in this territory was the difference between legal and fraudulent. She had the clerk make her 3 copies of every page. She paid the $1.60 without flinching. She put the copies inside her shirt against her skin, under the coat, because she was not going to carry documents this important anywhere they could be easily taken. On her way out, she stopped. There was a man in the waiting area she hadn't noticed when she arrived. Heavy-set, well-dressed in the way of money rather than fashion, with the specific quality of someone who was waiting without any appearance of impatience. The kind of man who was good at waiting because he'd learned that patience was a form of power. He looked at her as she passed. She looked back because looking away is the thing that tells a person they've made you nervous. He said nothing. She walked out. She didn't know if he was one of Croft's people. She didn't know if his presence was coincidence. But she was aware of him, and she walked to where Cass was tied with a pace that was ordinary and unhurried and nothing like what her pulse was doing. She left Helena within the hour without going back to the farmstead she'd planned to stay at, cutting west instead of east for the first few miles before looping back to the Cross Ridge Road. The ride back took 2 days. She stopped only when she had to, fed Cass and herself at a trading post the first evening, where the woman behind the counter asked no questions and gave her an extra piece of dried venison without charging for it, which was the kind of generosity that doesn't announce itself. She arrived at Cross Ridge on a late afternoon with the light going gold and sideways, the way it did in Montana when the day was giving up. She was saddle sore and tired, and her back hurt from 2 nights of poor sleep, and she had certified copies of a survey document folded against her chest. Wyatt was at the fence line when she came up the road. He saw her from 50 yards and held still while she rode the last stretch, and she could see him doing the particular calculation of a man checking whether the person coming back looks like the person who left or like something went wrong. She pulled up beside him and reached inside her coat and held out the papers. He took them, read the first page, looked up. "Is this what I think it is? Original survey, certified copies." She let Cass have her head, the mare already angling toward the barn. Keene's northeastern boundary contradicts Croft's February survey by 8 feet past the session line. Wyatt looked at the papers again. His jaw was tight. "He knew," Wyatt said. "He knew Keene's records were in Helena, and he knew I wasn't in a position to go get them." He counted on the fact that a man managing a ranch alone with 4 children and a recent bereavement wouldn't have the time or the resources to pull original records, Adeline said. He was nearly right. Wyatt looked at her with an expression she didn't entirely know what to do with. Something more than gratitude, more complicated than relief. Like a man who has been holding himself together at significant cost and has just been handed something that makes the effort feel less futile. "Adeline," he said. "Don't," she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say. "Save it until we've actually won." She rode Cass into the barn. Inside the house, she could smell that someone had been cooking. Clara, she guessed, from the slightly uneven smell of cornbread that had gone a little long on the left side. She could hear Robbie somewhere upstairs doing the specific stomping run of a 4-year-old who has decided running is faster than walking, and Lily's voice telling him to stop, and his gleeful refusal. She unsaddled Cass and rubbed her down and gave her grain, doing it slowly and methodically because the horse had earned it, and because Adeline needed 10 minutes in the quiet dark of the barn before she went back into the house and started figuring out what came next. The documents were real. The case was there. But Harlan Croft was not a man who would look at evidence and quietly step aside. She knew his type, not specifically, but categorically. The careful, patient kind of corrupt, the kind that built his moves over years and had friends in the right offices and knew how to make things difficult for people who got in his way. She was in his way now whether he knew her name or not. She leaned her forehead briefly against Cass's neck, the warm animal smell of her, and let herself be tired for just a moment. Then she straightened up and went back to the house. The county assessor's office in Garrison was a single room above the hardware store, accessible by an exterior staircase that had been built by someone who either didn't understand level or didn't care about it. The steps tilted left, and the railing wobbled, and the whole structure announced visitors before they reached the top, which Adeline suspected was not entirely accidental. She had been to that office twice in the week since returning from Helena. The first time to file a formal contest to Croft's February survey, attaching the certified copies of Keene's original boundary work. The second time to confirm the contest had been logged and to find out when the hearing would be scheduled. The assessor was a man named Birch, compact, 50s, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to survive in a town where one man owned the freight operation, the dry goods store, and the goodwill of half the county. He had taken her documents and looked at them and told her the hearing would be in 3 weeks. 3 weeks? She had told Wyatt that evening. He had nodded and said nothing for a moment, and then asked if she thought Croft would show up himself. "He'll have a lawyer," she said. "Maybe 2. And we'll have the original survey, properly certified, and a clear measurement discrepancy." She looked at him. "And me?" He looked back. That's not nothing, he said, which was as close to a declaration of confidence as she'd heard from him, and she accepted it as such. But 3 weeks in a place like Garrison, with Croft's name on half the commerce and his influence in the county offices, 3 weeks was a long time for things to go wrong. They went wrong on day 4. Adeline was in town buying flour and salt at the general store, not Croft's dry goods. She'd been going to a smaller operation on the south end of Main Street, run by an older woman named Mrs. Pell, who had the leathery competence of someone who had outlasted everyone who'd ever underestimated her. She was at the counter working through the list when she heard it. 2 men in the corner of the store, not quite bothering to lower their voices. "Ashcroft Ranch," one said. "Heard his new housekeeper's been up to Helena pulling records." "That right." "Croft knows about it. He's not happy." "Croft's never happy when someone finds paper he didn't want found." A pause. Then more quietly, "Word is he's going to have the survey certified by the county surveyor before the hearing. Override the Helena records." The other man made a sound she couldn't interpret. "County surveyor's on his payroll." That's the point. She didn't turn around. She finished her transaction with Mrs. Pell at a pace that communicated nothing, took her goods, and left. She was 2 blocks from the store when a man stepped out of a doorway in front of her. Not dramatically. Just a man adjusting his course to intercept hers, which he accomplished by simply standing in the middle of the boardwalk. He was heavy-set, well-dressed. She recognized him from the land office in Helena. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. She stopped. "You have me at a disadvantage. You know my name." "Harlan Croft." He said it the way men say their own names when they've spent years watching other people react to the sound of it, waiting for the reaction. She let him wait. "I thought you'd be taller," she said. Something moved in his expression. Surprise, she thought, quickly controlled. He was a man who was accustomed to the effect his name had, and she had just declined to provide it. "You've been busy," he said. 60 miles to Helena is a serious undertaking for a housekeeper." "I've walked further than 60 miles lately," she said. "Is there something you want to say to me, Mr. Croft, or are you planning to just stand in the middle of the boardwalk?" He smiled. It was the smile of a man who found certain things amusing when he was confident they would resolve in his favor. "You filed a contest to my survey." "Mr. Ashcroft filed a contest to your survey. I assisted with the documentation." "Semantics." "Accuracy," she said. "There's a difference." He studied her. She was aware that he was doing a calculation. The same kind of calculation men like him always did with women like her, trying to determine what category she fit into and therefore how to handle her. She didn't help him. "The hearing is in 3 weeks, he said. "I have attorneys who do this professionally. You have," he glanced at her flour and salt, "household goods. And a certified original survey showing your boundary claim is 8 feet outside the cession agreement you tricked a grieving man into signing," she said. The word "tricked" landed in the space between them, and she watched him decide how to respond to it. "Strong words," he said. "Accurate ones." He was quiet for a moment. The smile had gone. What replaced it was more specific. Not anger, not quite. More the look of a man adjusting his initial read of a situation. "You don't have any protection here," he said. "You're a widow from Billings with no family in this territory. If this contest fails, and it will fail, Mrs. Mercer, because I have been operating in this county for 15 years and I know every person who matters, you'll have made a powerful enemy for a man who let you sleep in his storage room." Adeline shifted the bag of flour to her other arm. "Mr. Croft," she said, "I have spent the last 6 weeks being turned away from doors, sleeping in creek beds, and walking alone across 40 miles of Montana in March. What exactly do you think you're threatening me with?" He blinked. Just once. It was the most honest thing his face had done in the conversation. "Think carefully about what you're doing," he said. "I think carefully about everything I do," she said. "That's rather the problem for you, isn't it?" She walked around him and continued down the boardwalk at the same pace she'd been moving before he stepped in front of her, because changing her pace would tell him something, and she wasn't willing to give him anything. She didn't look back. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with something like relief, because inside she was running a temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. She was furious. Not afraid, or not primarily afraid, furious in the deep, banked way she'd learned to manage during the worst years on the farm. The kind of anger that doesn't flame and go out but settles into something steady and useful. He had stood on a public street and told her, with that careful smile, that she had no protection, that she was alone, that she should consider the position she was in relative to the position he was in and draw the appropriate conclusion. The appropriate conclusion being that she should stop. She was not going to stop. She told Wyatt that evening, all of it. The conversation in the store about the county surveyor, the confrontation on the boardwalk. She told him plainly and without dramatizing it, because she needed him to understand the shape of what they were dealing with. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to appreciate about him. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup and listened until she was finished, and then was quiet for a moment. "The county surveyor," he said. "Birch's office uses whoever the county has on retainer. If Croft can get his own man certified as the county surveyor before the hearing, he buries Keene's records. He doesn't bury them. They're certified federal documents. He can't make them disappear. But if a sitting county surveyor produces a contradicting assessment and the assessor rules in favor of local authority over territorial records, it ties it up in appeals for years," Wyatt said, "which is what he actually wants. He doesn't need to win outright. He just needs it to be uncertain long enough that I can't get financing, can't sell, can't do anything." She nodded. "He squeezes you until you have to settle. Probably accepts the water rights and the Northeast Strip in exchange for dropping the dispute. And I lose the creek access, which means the Southeast pasture can't support cattle through summer," she said, "which makes a third of the ranch unworkable." The lamp on the table burned between them. Outside, the wind had come up, the way it always did after dark in April. Not mean, just present, reminding you it was still there. "There's something else," Adeline said. He looked at her. "He has people who can find out things. He knew my name in Helena before I'd given it to anyone except the land office clerk. He knew you'd hired a housekeeper." She paused. "Someone in your circle talks." Wyatt's expression went flat in a way she hadn't seen before. "Who?" "I don't know. I'm telling you to be careful. My hands. Don't accuse anyone. Just be careful about what you say out loud and to whom." He absorbed this. The flatness in his expression moved towards something colder, and she understood. This was worse than a land dispute. This was someone in his household or close to it who had been carrying information to Croft. "This doesn't change the case," she said, before he could go somewhere too dark with it. "The documents are real. The measurement discrepancy is real. What we need is to get in front of a hearing where those documents carry weight and where the assessor can't simply defer to a Croft-aligned county surveyor." "How do we do that?" She'd been thinking about this since the boardwalk. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Helena has jurisdiction over disputes involving certified federal survey records. If we file a concurrent petition there, before the county hearing, we establish that this is not purely a local matter. It forces the county assessor to at least consider that his ruling might be reviewed at the territorial level. "You want to go back to Helena?" "I want to send the petition. I can write it. What I need is for you to sign it and for us to get it to Helena before Croft gets his surveyor certified." "How long do we have?" "I don't know exactly. A week? Maybe less." She looked at him steadily. "Can you spare the horse?" His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Wry, thin, a little tired. "Can I stop you?" "No," she said, without any particular inflection. This time it was closer to a real smile, brief and reluctant. "Cass goes better with a looser rein on the left," he said. "She'll fight you otherwise." "She's been fighting me since day one," Adeline said. "We've reached an understanding." She spent that night writing the petition by lamplight, long after the house was quiet. It had to be precise. She was not a lawyer, and she knew it, and the surest way to undermine a legitimate claim was imprecise language that trained legal eyes could pick apart. She wrote it and rewrote it, stripping out anything that was assertion rather than documented fact, grounding every statement in the physical measurements from Keene's survey and the specific legal language of the Section 14 provision Croft had used. At some point around midnight, she became aware that someone was in the kitchen doorway. Clara, in her nightgown, hair loose, holding a candle, a 13-year-old who had her dead mother's precise dark eyes and her living father's capacity for watching without speaking. "You're still up," Clara said. "So are you." "I couldn't sleep." A pause. "What are you writing?" Adeline considered how much to explain. She decided on all of it. Clara was not a child who benefited from being protected from information. She benefited from being trusted with it. She explained the petition, the timeline, what she thought Croft was planning to do. Clara listened in the same way her father did, with complete stillness. "If this doesn't work," Clara said, "do we lose the ranch?" "Possibly. Not immediately. But the pressure would build to a point where your father couldn't sustain it. And if it does work, then it goes to the county hearing with the territorial commissioner's office aware of the dispute. That changes the political calculation for the assessor." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers on the table. "Mama tried to explain the accounts to me once," she said. "I didn't really listen. I thought there'd be time to learn later." Adeline didn't say anything to that. She knew the particular quality of that regret, the things you thought you'd have time for. "I'm listening now," Clara said. "I know you are," Adeline said. Clara pulled out the chair across the table and sat down and looked at the petition. "Show me what you're writing," she said. So Adeline showed her. The petition left for Helena 2 days later with one of the hired hands, a taciturn older man named Berkey, who asked no questions and had the look of someone who'd made harder rides for worse reasons. Adeline had debated going herself, but decided against it. She needed to be at the county hearing when it happened, and she didn't want to be 60 miles away if things moved faster than expected. They moved faster than expected. The hearing was pulled forward, not 3 weeks, 10 days. She found out from Mrs. Pell at the South End store who'd heard from the hardware man, who'd apparently overheard a conversation in Birch's office. "Assessor moved it up," Mrs. Pell said, handing Adeline her change. "Pressure from somewhere." Croft, Adeline thought. He was moving before the territorial petition could be processed. She rode back to Crossridge and told Wyatt. He was in the barn when she arrived. He was often in the barn in the afternoon, she'd noticed, the way Thomas was. The Ashcroft men apparently found it easier to think in the presence of animals than people. She told him about the hearing date change from the barn doorway and watched his face. 10 days, he said. "Yes. The petition may not be processed by then. We can't count on it." He set down the harness he'd been working on. "Then what do we do?" This was the question she'd been working on since Mrs. Pell's store. What they had was a certified survey. What they needed was for that survey to matter in a room where one man's influence was significant enough that he'd been able to move a scheduled hearing. "We make it public," she said, "before the hearing. We don't let it be a quiet proceeding in an upstairs office where Birch can rule any way he wants and nobody sees it." "How?" "The hearing is supposed to be open to the public. County record. We make sure people come." She paused. "Ranchers, farmers. Anyone who has had a boundary dispute or a water rights issue with Croft. Anyone who has felt the edge of how he operates. We find them and we tell them the hearing is happening and we make sure they're in that room." "You want an audience?" "I want witnesses," she said. "There's a difference. An assessor who rules against clear evidence in front of 20 ranchers has to live in this county afterward. Birch is not a bad man. I don't think he's on Croft's payroll, not directly. I think he's a careful man who has learned to make decisions that don't create enemies. We need to make the other side of this visible to him." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about little else for the last 4 days. Who do you know in this county?" "Nobody," she said. "But you've been here for 12 years. You know people." Something shifted in his face at that. She could see him moving from the passive position he'd been in since Eleanor died, the position of a man things were happening to, into something more active. "I know people," he said. "Then let's go talk to them," Adeline said. The next 6 days were the most exhausting stretch of what had already been an exhausting month. They split the work. Wyatt rode to speak with ranchers he knew, men who'd had their own small run-ins with Croft's expansion, men who'd signed things they perhaps hadn't fully read, men who'd watched their neighbors lose property in ways that looked legal but felt wrong. Adeline took the closer contacts. Mrs. Pell, 2 farm wives she'd met at the trading post, a retired assayman who lived at the edge of town and had kept records of every land transaction in the county for 30 years because he found it interesting. The retired assayman was named Pruitt, and he was the most valuable conversation she had. He was 80 if he was a day, with the sharp-eyed clarity of someone whose body had given up on enthusiasm, but whose mind hadn't. He received her in a small house so full of paper that the walkways between furniture were the only open space, and he listened to her lay out the case against Croft with the expression of someone hearing something they had been waiting to hear for a long time. 8 feet past the session line, he said, when she finished, confirmed by Keene's original measurements. Keene was thorough, Pruitt said. I knew him. He measured twice and then measured again because he didn't trust once. Do you have any records that corroborate the original boundary? Pruitt looked at her over the rims of his glasses. Then he got up, moved through the paper canyon of his living room, and came back with a ledger that he set on the table between them. I copied the boundary descriptions from every homestead filing in this county for 20 years, he said, because the territorial office lost documents 3 times, and I didn't trust them to keep what mattered. This is the Ashcroft homestead entry, 1872. He turned to a page and pointed. The copied description matched Keene's original, down to the measurement, third-party corroboration, in a 30-year-old ledger kept by a man with no stake in the current dispute. Would you be willing to come to the hearing? Adeline asked. Pruitt closed the ledger. I'm 81 years old, he said. I haven't left this house in 6 months. My hip doesn't do stairs. He paused. But if you come back before the hearing, I'll write a sworn statement. Notarized. I still have my notary seal. I'll be back tomorrow morning, she said. She was. The day of the hearing arrived gray and cold, with a sky that hadn't decided whether it wanted to rain. The upstairs office above the hardware store was standing room by the time Wyatt and Adeline arrived, which she hadn't entirely expected and which she could see surprised Wyatt. The visible evidence that people had come, ranchers she'd never met, farm wives, the man from the trading post, Mrs. Pell, who had brought her knitting and sat in the back corner with the calm of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. Croft was already there. 2 attorneys flanked him, well-dressed and carrying briefcases with the performed confidence of men who'd won rooms like this before. Croft himself stood near the assessor's desk and spoke quietly with Birch in the manner of a man who considers the proceeding a formality. He saw Adeline and Wyatt come in. He saw the room. Something moved in his face. A recalculation, brief and controlled. Birch called the proceeding to order with the mildly overwhelmed air of a man who had expected to manage a quiet administrative hearing and found himself in front of an audience. He cleared his throat twice. He stated the matter, the contested survey, the competing claims, the attached documents. Croft's lead attorney spoke first. He was fluent and dismissive, framing the territorial survey as outdated, the certified copies as insufficient grounds for contesting a current assessment, the Ashcroft claim as the sentimental attachment of a ranching family to measurements made 15 years ago. Adeline listened to all of it without expression. When Birch asked if the contesting party wished to present their position, Wyatt started to stand. Adeline put her hand briefly on his arm, not to stop him, just to indicate that she would go first, and stood herself. She had never spoken in a formal proceeding. She knew this. She was aware of Croft's attorneys watching her with the evaluating look of men deciding whether to take her seriously. She laid Keene's survey on Birch's desk. She laid Pruitt's notarized statement beside it. She laid the measurement comparison she had prepared, clean, numbered, showing in plain terms the 8-foot discrepancy between Keene's original northeast boundary and Croft's February survey. She did not use legal language. She used numbers. The session agreement signed by Mr. Ashcroft in March of 1923 transferred a 40-foot strip along the northeastern boundary, she said. Mr. Croft's February survey draws the new boundary 8 feet further north than the post-session line established by the original survey. That 8 feet is not covered by the session agreement. It was not negotiated, not signed, and not agreed to. It is a unilateral claim that relies on the original surveyor being deceased and his records being inconveniently located 60 miles away. She paused. The records are no longer inconveniently located. One of Croft's attorneys started to object. Birch held up a hand. Croft himself spoke then, for the first time, leaning forward slightly. Mrs. Mercer. His voice was measured, the voice he'd used on the boardwalk, patient, certain of the ground he stood on. These documents are your interpretation. The county has the right to conduct its own survey, Conducted by a surveyor you employ, Adeline said. That is Mr. Croft. She looked at him directly, the same way she'd looked at him on the boardwalk, the same blankness that declined to perform fear. I have certified federal survey documents. I have a 30-year-old ledger entry made by a disinterested party that corroborates the original boundary. I have a notarized statement from Aldous Keene's contemporary confirming his methodology. She paused. I have in my bag 3 additional copies of every document I've just presented, addressed to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Helena, the county court clerk, and the Billings Gazette. She let that land. If this hearing results in a ruling that contradicts the documented evidence, those copies will be delivered tomorrow morning. The room was quiet, in the specific way of a room full of people who are paying close attention. Croft looked at her. She looked back. In his face, she could see it, the recalculation, more significant this time. He was a patient man. He had built this over 2 years. He had moved the hearing forward to beat the territorial petition. He had positioned his attorneys and his county connections and his 15 years of local influence. He had not positioned for public exposure. He had not positioned for copies going to Helena and to a newspaper. He had not positioned for a room full of ranchers watching his methodology explained out loud. This is a bluff, he said. No, Adeline said. It's a threat. There's a difference. A bluff is something you make when you don't have the cards. I have the cards. She held his gaze. Withdraw the February survey and abandon the boundary claim, and the copies stay in my bag. Continue with this proceeding, and I guarantee the Territorial Commissioner's office will be reviewing everything you've done in this county for the last 5 years. Croft's jaw was tight. His attorneys leaned in, one on each side, speaking quietly. He waved them off with a short, sharp gesture, the gesture of a man who does not want to be managed in public. The silence stretched. 20 people in that room, not one of them making a sound. Mr. Birch, Croft said finally, his voice still controlled but different now, flatter, stripped of its comfortable certainty. I'm withdrawing the February survey. Birch blinked. The claim? Withdrawn, Croft said. He picked up his hat from the desk. His attorneys looked at each other with the expression of men who have not been included in a decision they're being paid to manage. The boundary dispute is closed. He walked out. His attorneys followed. The room stayed quiet until the sound of his feet on the tilting staircase had gone, and then it wasn't quiet anymore. Wyatt was standing beside her. She hadn't heard him stand. She was aware of his presence, solid, close, and of his hand moving briefly to her elbow, steadying her, which was the first time he had touched her, and the contact lasted about 2 seconds before he removed it. She was shaking, she realized, not visibly. She would have bet money that it wasn't visible, but inside, in the legs, in the hands. She had not been certain it would work. She had calculated it could work. She had laid every piece of evidence in the right order and made the threat credible by making it specific, and she had looked Harlan Croft in the eye and not flinched. But she had not been certain, because you are never certain. And the gap between what you plan and what actually happens in a room full of people is where everything falls apart or comes together. It had come together, this time. Birch was saying something official about the withdrawal. People around her were talking. Mrs. Pell was putting away her knitting with the satisfied expression of someone whose assessment of the morning's outcome had never been in serious doubt. Are you all right? Wyatt asked, very quietly, next to her. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. You're shaking. I know, she said. I'll stop in a minute. He didn't say anything else. He stood beside her while Birch concluded the administrative record, and the room began to empty, and the shaking settled, and the gray April light came through the office's single window and fell across the papers on the desk. Keene's survey, Prewitt's statement, the measurement comparison she'd written by lamplight 3 nights ago, and Adeline looked at them and thought about an old dead surveyor who had measured twice and then measured again because he didn't trust once. It had mattered. All that precision, all those years ago, it had mattered today. She gathered the papers from Birch's desk and put them carefully back in her bag. And when she walked down the tilting staircase and out onto the street of Garrison, Montana, The sky had made its decision about the rain and was beginning, tentatively, to deliver on it. The rain that started on the steps of Birch's office followed them all the way back to Crossridge, a thin April rain that couldn't quite commit to being serious but refused to stop entirely. By the time they reached the ranch, Adeline's coat was soaked through at the shoulders and Wyatt's hat had given up its shape, and the mud in the yard was the particular heavy kind that pulled at every step. Clara was on the porch when they rode in. She'd been watching the road. Adeline could tell from the way she was standing, too still, positioned to see the approach. And when she saw them, she came down the steps without a coat, which told Adeline something about how long she'd been waiting and what it had cost her. "Well?" she said. "Croft withdrew," Wyatt said. Clara stood in the rain and processed this. Her face went through several things in quick succession. Relief, something that might have been the edge of tears that she immediately controlled, and then the specific expression of a 13-year-old girl who has been holding herself tightly for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. She didn't cry. She hugged her father instead, hard and fast, the way children hug when they've decided they're too old for it but can't help themselves. He wrapped his arms around her and held on, and Adeline looked away and gave them that. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Lily had apparently taken it upon herself to keep the fire going in their absence, a project she reported on with great thoroughness while Adeline peeled off her wet coat and hung it near the stove. Thomas was at the table doing sums with the particular performance of someone who has been obviously not doing sums for hours and is now pretending otherwise. Robbie was asleep on the low cot, one arm hanging off the edge, undisturbed by the noise. "Did you win?" Thomas asked, not looking up from his sums. "The claim was withdrawn," Adeline said. Thomas looked up. "That means yes." "That means yes." He went back to his sums, but his pencil moved differently after that. Less tense, she thought. A small change, but she noticed it. The days that followed had a different quality to them. Not easier, exactly. There was still too much work and not enough money, and the southeast pasture still needed attention before summer, and one of the fence lines on the northern boundary had heaved in the freeze-thaw cycle and needed resetting before the cattle wandered. The practical problems of a working ranch did not pause to acknowledge victories, which was probably correct. Life on the frontier had never rewarded sentiment. But the particular weight that had sat over the household, the low, grinding pressure of something being taken, of the ground shifting underfoot without anyone being able to say precisely how, that lifted. Adeline felt it go, and she suspected the children felt it too, though none of them had words for it. What she noticed most was Wyatt. He had been, since her arrival, a man doing the minimum amount of existing that kept the ranch functional and his children fed. He ate what she put in front of him. He answered when spoken to. He did the physical work of the ranch with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has forgotten why they're doing it, but can't stop because stopping is worse. She'd watched this for weeks and understood it. Grief worked that way, she knew. It made people very good at the motions of living while hollowing out everything underneath. It happened gradually, in small increments. He started giving instructions to the hired hands again, with actual authority, rather than the apologetic suggestions he'd been offering before. He came to dinner and sat down without needing to be called twice. He asked Thomas one evening to show him the sums he'd been working on, and she heard them at the table for 40 minutes, Wyatt's voice patient and occasionally amused, a sound she hadn't heard much of, the particular dry humor of a man who has more of it than he's been able to use. He started talking to her at dinner, not about the accounts or the ranch business. He'd always done that. About other things. A story about the first winter at Crossridge before Clara was born, when the snow came in October and didn't leave until April, and he and Eleanor had been so isolated that they'd read every book they owned twice, and then started reading them to each other backward for variety. He told this story with the careful lightness of someone beginning to sort through what's too painful to say and what can be offered, and Adeline listened without prompting him toward anything. She was aware that things were changing. She was also aware that she had not yet told him about the letter. It had arrived 10 days after the hearing, forwarded from Patrice's address in Billings, the only address she'd left with anyone. The return address was a law office in Helena, and the contents were 4 pages that she'd read 3 times before she trusted what they said. Daniel had carried a life insurance policy. She had not known about it. He had purchased it in the 2nd year of his illness, apparently, from a territorial insurance company out of Helena, and had paid the premiums himself from a small account she hadn't known existed, either because he'd intended to tell her and never found the right moment, or because he'd been trying to protect her from hoping for it. The policy named her as beneficiary. The law office had been attempting to locate her for 8 months. The amount was $470. She had sat with this information for 3 days before she could think about it clearly. $470 was not a fortune, but it was enough to buy passage east to her cousin in Ohio, who had offered years ago and would probably still offer if asked. Enough to rent a room somewhere and spend a month figuring out a plan without desperation driving every decision. Enough to start something, a boarding house, a small business, something that belonged to her and to no one else. It was enough to leave. She knew as she sat with this knowledge in the privacy of the storage room that had become her room, that this was the question she was actually being asked. Not where she could go or what she could do. The question was whether she wanted to. She made herself think about it honestly, because she'd been honest with herself all her life, and she was not going to stop now. She had arrived at Cross Ridge 6 weeks ago with nothing except bread and the specific stubbornness of someone who had run out of other options. She had stayed because they needed her, and because she had found something to fight for, which was the thing she had not realized she'd been missing since Daniel died. Not comfort, not security, but a reason to use everything she had in her. Now the fight was over. The ranch was safe. Robbie had color in his face. Clara had started sleeping past 5 in the morning. Thomas had begun explaining, at dinner, the specific inefficiencies he'd identified in the way the barn was organized, with the unself-conscious authority of a 10-year-old who has recently been taken seriously and found he has opinions. Lily had made Adeline a gift, a small, flat braid of grass, because Lily had been experimenting with braiding and Adeline was the nearest available recipient, and presented it with the gravity of an official ceremony. They didn't need her the way they had 6 weeks ago, but she was not ready to leave. And when she examined that feeling carefully, she found that it was not about being needed. It was about belonging somewhere, which was different. Belonging was what you felt when a place and the people in it had become the shape your days fit around, without you noticing it was happening until it had already happened. She needed to tell Wyatt about the money. She had put it off, and she knew why. She was afraid of what came after the telling. The moment he knew she could leave, the question of whether she would become real between them in a way it hadn't been before, and she didn't know how that conversation ended. She told him on a Thursday evening after the children were in bed. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table with the letter in her hand and said, "I need to show you something," and put it in front of him. He read it. She watched his face and read it too. The careful neutrality of a man absorbing information while keeping his reaction private. He set it down and looked at her. "When did this arrive?" 12 days ago. Something moved in his expression. "You've been sitting on it for 12 days. I needed to think." He nodded slowly. Then, "What are you thinking?" This was the question. She'd prepared an answer and now discarded it, because he'd asked it simply, and she owed him the same. "I'm thinking that I don't want to leave," she said. "But I needed to tell you about the money before I made any decisions, because you deserve to know what my actual situation is." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because when I arrived here I had nothing, and you took me in. And I want you to understand that I'm not staying because I have nothing. I'm staying because I want to." The lamp between them was low. She'd been meaning to trim the wick and hadn't gotten to it. The light it put out was warm and slightly uneven, and it made the kitchen look the way kitchens look in the hour before the household goes to sleep. Lived in and imperfect and very much inhabited. Wyatt looked at the letter and then at her and then back at the table. "There's something I should have said," he started, and then stopped, and she could see him weighing it. The gap between what he was willing to say and what the words actually were. "You don't have to say anything tonight," she said. "I know I don't have to." He looked up. "Adeline, this ranch, what it is now, what the kids are now, that's because you walked through that gate 5 weeks ago." He paused. "I'm not good at saying this kind of thing. Eleanor always said I was better at doing than talking." "She was right," Adeline said. "You are." He absorbed this. "What I'm trying to say is that whatever you want to do with that money, if you want to go east, if you want to start something else somewhere, I'm not going to tell you not to. You've earned the right to choose." "I know," she said. "I'm choosing to stay." He held her gaze. Why? She thought about this. Because I'm good here, she said. And I don't mean the work. I mean, she stopped, found it again. I mean, I know where things are. I know the stove and the water pump, and that Cass fights the left rein, and that Thomas is better with the cattle than he thinks he is, and that Robbie's going to be all right, and that Clara is going to be something formidable when she grows up. She paused. I've spent 6 weeks building something I actually want. I'd be a fool to walk away from it. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. I want to make a proposal, he said. She waited. The money, if you're willing, I want you to invest it in the ranch, not as wages, not as charity, as a partner's stake. He said it with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed this but is still not certain about the delivery. You'd own a share, legally. I'd have papers drawn up. She studied him. That's not what people expect the proposal to be in a situation like this. Something moved in his face, a warmth she hadn't seen there before, uncertain and honest. I know it's not, he said, but I'm not going to say the other thing tonight, because you just told me you want to stay, and I don't want you to think that one thing is a condition of the other. She understood exactly what he meant. She appreciated it more than she could say directly, so she said it sideways. That's the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me in several years. I mean it. I know you do. She looked at the letter on the table. The partnership. What percentage? He named a figure. She counteroffered. He considered it and accepted, which she expected. It was a fair counter, and he was a fair man. I'll need it in writing before I put any money down, she said. Obviously, he said, and there it was again. That dry, reluctant humor, coming easier now. She took the letter back and folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and the weight of it felt different than it had for the 12 days she'd been carrying it. Not lighter, just settled, like a thing that had found its proper place. What followed was not dramatic. That was the honest truth of it. The weeks after the hearing and the partnership agreement were not a transformation, they were an accumulation. The slow, unglamorous work of building something functional out of pieces that had been damaged. The accounts were the first thing Adeline addressed formally, now that her role had a legal definition. She sat down with Wyatt's bank in Billings, by letter first, then in person when it couldn't be avoided, and restructured the supply credit with the leverage of a resolved land dispute and a clear record of the southeastern pasture's carrying capacity. The bank's man in Garrison was a different person with her than he'd been with Wyatt, which she noted and filed away with the long list of things that made her angry that she didn't have time to be angry about right now. She taught Clara the accounts. Not as a lesson, Clara resisted being taught things that felt like lessons, but as a shared task. They worked through the books together in the evening, Adeline explaining her notation system, Clara offering improvements that were occasionally better, which Adeline adopted without performance of being impressed, which was the correct response. Why do you carry this number forward here instead of here? Clara asked one evening, pointing. Because this column is running total, and this column is period total. If I carry it here, I lose the running figure for the quarter. Clara studied it. But if you put the period total here and kept the running here, you'd see them both at once. Adeline looked at the ledger. You're right, she said. That's better. And she changed it. Clara looked at her with that measuring expression she'd had since the first day. You're not going to tell me I should have thought of that myself? Clara said. No, it's a good idea. I'll use it. A pause. Mama used to say that about ideas. She said a good idea belonged to whoever used it best, not whoever thought of it first. She sounds like she was practical, Adeline said. She was. Clara's voice was even. She would have liked you, I think. She liked people who did things. Adeline did not make too much of this. She simply said, That's a generous thing to say, and they went back to the ledger. Thomas was a different kind of project. He had been operating since Eleanor's death on the understanding that his job was to take up less space, to need less, ask for less, be less in the way. It was the way some children responded to loss, Adeline had noticed. They made themselves smaller, as if the grief in the household were a finite resource, and using any of it for yourself was a theft from someone with a greater claim. She addressed this indirectly because direct was not available with Thomas. She asked him to take on the cattle count. not as a child's task, as a genuine responsibility, with a real ledger and the expectation that his numbers would be used to make decisions. He approached this with the terrified seriousness of someone who has been trusted with something important and is not sure they're capable of it. The first count had 2 errors. She sat down with him, found the errors, explained them, sent him back to recount. The second attempt was right. "That's accurate," she told him. "How do you know?" "Because I checked it against last month's, and the natural variation is within expected range. Also because you're careful." She paused. "You're good with numbers when you trust yourself." Thomas looked at the ledger as if it were evidence in a trial he hadn't known was happening. "My teacher in Garrison said I was slow." "Your teacher in Garrison was wrong." He didn't say anything, but he held on to the ledger when he left the kitchen, carrying it the way people carry things they've decided are worth protecting. Robbie simply attached himself to Adeline with the uncomplicated loyalty of a 4-year-old who has decided someone is his. He helped her in the kitchen with the specificity of a child who has very strong opinions about which tasks are his. He was in charge of handing her the wooden spoon, in charge of the flour canister lid, and in charge of informing her when the bread smelled done, a judgment he delivered with great solemnity and which was, she discovered, entirely reliable. "How do you know when it's done?" she asked him once. "It smells different," he said. "How does it smell?" He considered this at length. "Like finished," he decided. She had started doing his hair in the mornings, not because he was Clara's responsibility now, but because Robbie had presented himself to her one morning with a comb and an expression of patient expectation, and she had accepted the implicit assignment. His hair was fine and dark and went its own way regardless of what was asked of it, and getting it into any kind of order required both negotiation and a particular technique involving water that he had opinions about the temperature of. "Cold," he said one morning. "It's barely cold." "Cold," he said again with great conviction. "All right," she said, and warmed it slightly, which she had been going to do anyway. She was aware doing this of what it looked like, what it was. She was aware of it in the way you're aware of a thing you haven't named yet, but which has a name available. She didn't rush toward it. Wyatt had been as good as his word. He hadn't said the other thing, the thing he'd named and set aside the night of the letter. He was present and warm and increasingly himself, but he held the particular careful distance of a man who has said he'll wait and means it. This she respected more than she would have respected urgency, but she noticed things. The way he positioned himself when she was at the stove, not in the way but close, occupying the same room with the ease of long habit. The way he'd started asking her opinion on decisions before making them, not deferring, but actually asking, genuinely wanting to know what she thought. The way he looked at her sometimes across the table, quick and then away. The look of someone checking on something they value. She was 40 days into the 2 weeks she'd come for. The partnership papers were drawn up by a lawyer in Garrison, a quiet man named Fetch, who appeared to have stayed determinedly neutral on the Croft matter, and who handled the transaction without comment. Adeline signed with her full name, Adeline Ruth Mercer. She watched it dry on the page and felt the specific solidity of something that now existed in the world and could not be undone. She owned a stake in Cross Ridge Ranch. Not a large one, but it was real and it was hers, and she had not been given it. She had earned it and then chosen it, which was a different thing. She rode back from Garrison alone that afternoon, the signed copy of the papers in her bag, and the May sun doing its best to convince the land that warmth was coming and not just passing through. The road between Garrison and Cross Ridge was familiar to her now. She knew the turn where the cottonwood had fallen last winter and been partially cleared, knew the place where the road dipped and held mud longest after rain, knew the ridge where you could see the ranch below, the main house and the outbuildings and the kitchen garden that had begun, tentatively, to show green. She stopped at the ridge and looked at it. The half-mended gate was still half-mended, she noticed. Someone had made another attempt on the second hinge and not quite finished it. She'd been meaning to ask Thomas to have a look at it. He was better with mechanical problems than his father, who approached hardware with more optimism than aptitude. Below, in the yard, she could see Lily chasing Edmund the gray cat with the focused determination of someone who has been told firmly that the cat does not want to be chased and has decided to test this hypothesis one more time. She could see Robbie sitting on the porch steps, watching in the role of interested observer. She could see Wyatt coming from the direction of the barn with his hat in his hand. He'd taken to holding his hat when he walked, she'd noticed, as if he needed something to do with his hands. He looked up. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but she could see the way he stilled when he spotted her at the ridge. The brief pause before he raised a hand. She raised hers back. Then she put Cass down the ridge road toward the ranch, toward the half-mended gate, and the kitchen that knew her and the stove that she understood now completely, toward the 4 children who had been broken open by loss and were slowly, imperfectly, figuring out how to be whole again, toward the man standing in the yard holding his hat. And the thing she felt riding down that slope had no single word for it, only the composite of many smaller words. Settled, chosen, real, home. Not perfect, not finished, not without the ongoing difficulty of 4 children and marginal accounts, and a fence line that still needed resetting, and a county where Harlan Croft still had his freight operation and his dry goods store and his particular patients. But hers. In a way that the farm had been hers and Daniel's together, this was hers in the way of something she had walked to and chosen and fought for and signed her name to. She came through the gate, the half-open one, still listing on its repaired hinge, and Robbie came off the porch steps at a run the moment he saw her, and Edmund escaped Lily's pursuit and disappeared under the porch, and Wyatt was crossing the yard toward her with his hat in his hand and the May sun on his face. She dismounted and Robbie reached her first, wrapping both arms around her leg with the complete conviction of a 4-year-old who sees no reason to be subtle about how he feels, and she put her hand on his head and looked over him at Wyatt, who had stopped a few feet away. "Paper signed?" he asked. "Paper signed," she said. He nodded. His jaw worked once, like there was something he was deciding. "Adeline," he said. She waited, but he shook his head, just slightly, and held out his hand for Cass's reins instead. "I'll take her," he said. "Supper's late. Clara burned the onions." "I didn't burn them," Clara called from the porch with dignity. "I caramelized them excessively." Adeline handed him the reins, and Robbie shifted his grip from her leg to her hand, and she walked toward the house with a 4-year-old towing her along, and the particular feeling of a woman who has found her footing on uncertain ground and discovered that it holds. Summer came to Cross Ridge the way it always did in Montana. Not gradually, not kindly, but all at once, as if the season had been waiting just past the ridgeline and finally lost patience. The creek ran high through June from snowmelt off the mountains, and the southeast pasture that had been the object of Croft's entire scheme turned green in a way that felt almost pointed, as if the land itself had an opinion about the outcome of the April hearing. The cattle moved to the summer pasture in late May. Thomas managed the count without being asked, producing a ledger entry that was accurate to the head, and notated in a system he'd developed himself. A small modification to Adeline's method that was, she told him, better than what she'd been doing. He received this information with the careful stillness of someone filing it away somewhere important. The fence line on the northern boundary got reset in the first week of June. Wyatt and both hired hands worked it over 3 days, and on the second day Thomas worked alongside them, not as a child helping, but as a 4th set of hands that was expected and needed. Adeline watched this from the kitchen garden, where she was doing the first serious weeding of the season, and did not comment on it to anyone. The kitchen garden was her particular project that summer. The soil in it had been let go for more than a year. Not abandoned entirely, but maintained at the level of someone doing the minimum necessary, which was what Clara had been doing with everything, conserving herself across too many fronts. Adeline dug it properly in May, working compost from the barn into the soil in a process that took 4 days and left her back an ongoing complaint. She planted in the established beds and added 2 new ones along the south fence, where the light was better. Lily helped. Or rather, Lily was present in the garden at all times in a way that was sometimes helpful and sometimes not. And Adeline had made her peace with this. The child had an instinct for what needed water and what didn't, which was useful, and a tendency to name individual plants, which was not useful but not harmful either. The tomato plants each had names by the second week of June, and Adeline did not ask about them or discourage the practice. "Edmund keeps sitting on the bean sprouts," Lily reported one morning, appearing at the kitchen door with dirt on both knees. "Put a rock at the end of each row. He doesn't like climbing over things." Lily considered this. "How do you know what Edmund doesn't like?" "Observation," Adeline said. "Same way you learn anything about anyone." Lily absorbed this and went back to the garden. Adeline heard the scraping sound of rocks being relocated with great purpose. Robbie turned 5 in July, a fact he began announcing in late June to ensure it was not forgotten. There had not been a birthday celebration at Crossridge the previous year. Eleanor had died in late winter, and the children's birthdays that followed had passed quietly, marked but not celebrated, the household not yet in a state to hold joy alongside grief. Adeline learned this from Clara, mentioned in passing, and said nothing about it at the time. She started planning in June. Not an elaborate plan. Robbie was 5. What 5-year-olds required was something that tasted sweet, something that involved being the center of attention, and something they did not expect. She consulted Lily, who was the family's expert on Robbie's preferences, and got a detailed briefing that covered his current favorite foods, his opinions on various activities, and his recent strong feeling that a cake with berries was better than a cake without berries, which he had expressed on multiple occasions to anyone willing to listen. Clara found out about the planning on a Tuesday and stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her expression at its most guarded. "He's going to make a complete fool of himself," Clara said. "He's 5, Adeline said. "He's entitled to. Last year we just—" She stopped. "I know," Adeline said. She kept measuring. "This year is different." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Can I make the berry preserves for the filling? Mama had a recipe." "I was hoping you'd offer," Adeline said. Clara uncrossed her arms. She came into the kitchen and found Eleanor's recipe in the box that lived on the second shelf, which Adeline had organized in April, but left untouched in its contents. She set it on the counter and studied it with the expression she used when she was trying not to feel too much about something. "She wrote notes in the margins," Clara said. "I noticed that when I organized the shelf. I didn't read them." Clara ran her finger along the edge of the card. "She wrote R doesn't like cloves and underlined it twice. R. Robbie." He would have been 3 when Eleanor made this recipe last. Eleanor had been sick by then, managing anyway, writing notes in the margins of recipe cards about what her youngest didn't like so she wouldn't forget, so that whoever came after her would know. "No cloves," Adeline said. "No cloves," Clara agreed, and got out the preserving pot. The birthday was a Tuesday. Robbie woke up and announced it was his birthday, with the energy of someone who had been saving this information under pressure and could finally release it. He was permitted to choose breakfast, which he exercised by requesting cornmeal porridge with maple syrup and 2 pieces of bread, a combination that surprised no one who knew him. He was given a carved wooden horse that Wyatt had been working on in the evenings in the barn, a fact he had believed was secret, but which the entire household had known about for 3 weeks. Robbie held the horse and looked at his father with the complete, uncomplicated love of a 5-year-old and said, "It looks like Cass." "It's supposed to look like Cass," Wyatt said. "Cass doesn't like her ears touched," Robbie said, examining the carved ears. "You should make them flatter." Wyatt looked at Adeline. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, which was the correct response. The cake happened at dinner. Berry filling, Clara's preserves, slightly imperfect layers because the oven ran hot on the left, and Adeline had overcompensated in the other direction this time. Thomas observed that the cake was lopsided. Clara told him that cakes were not structural elements, and lopsided didn't matter. Lily suggested that lopsided cakes had more frosting on one side, which was actually better. Robbie agreed with Lily enthusiastically and requested the most lopsided piece. Adeline sat at the end of the table and watched this, and felt something she didn't try to put a name to right away. Let it be present first. It was not a perfect evening. Thomas spilled his milk and was embarrassed about it. Lily ate too much cake and was sick afterward briefly, and had to be managed by Clara with the brisk competence of an older sibling who has dealt with this before. Wyatt burned his hand on the lamp globe, reaching past it to refill the water pitcher, and said a word in front of the children that he then had to account for, which he did by looking at the ceiling for a moment and then saying it was a word he should not have used and he was sorry. "What does it mean?" Robbie asked. "Nothing useful," Wyatt said. "Then why did you say it?" "Pain sometimes makes people say useless things," Adeline said. "It's a design flaw in people." Robbie found this philosophically satisfying and went back to his cake. After the children were in bed, Adeline was at the kitchen table going through the July accounts when Wyatt came back downstairs. She heard him on the steps and did not look up, giving him the chance to get coffee or whatever he'd come for without having to account for being there. He sat down across from her instead. with his coffee. The way he had on the first night she'd worked through the accounts. The same lamp between them, the same kitchen. She looked up. He had his hands around the cup, and he was looking at her with the specific expression she'd come to know over the past months. The one that meant he was about to say something he'd been preparing. "Adeline," he said. "Wyatt," she said. He almost smiled. "I've been trying to say something for about 2 months." "I know," she said. "You've been working up to it. Is it that obvious?" "To me," she said. "Probably not to the children." He looked at his coffee, then at her. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was choosing words carefully, and she let him choose them. "I know how you came here," he said, "and I know why you stayed. Or I know what you said about wanting to stay, about this being yours. I believe that. I'm not—" He stopped, tried from a different angle. "I don't want to make it complicated." "You're not making it complicated," she said. "It's already complicated. We live in the same house and run a business together. And your youngest son considers me personally responsible for breakfast. It has been complicated for some time." Something loosened in him at that. The particular tension of a man who has been trying to find the right words and has just been told that the words don't need to be perfect. "I'd like to make it something else too," he said. "If you're willing, if it's something you want." She looked at him, the lamp between them, the kitchen that she knew like she knew her own hands now, every quirk and sticking point and particular character of it. "It's something I want," she said. He exhaled. Just once, brief, like a man setting down something heavy. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "Eleanor would tell you, I go quiet when things are hard. And I'm better in the barn than in conversation, and I have 4 children who are—" "Wonderful," she said. He blinked. "Difficult and wonderful," she amended, "which is what children are supposed to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know you don't have to." "Wyatt," she said, "I signed a legal document putting my money into this property. I am not someone who does that and then changes her mind." She paused. "Ask me properly." His mouth curved. Properly this time. A real smile, one of the ones that reached his eyes, which were less tired than they'd been in April and still not entirely rested. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, and that was that. Not a grand moment. No particular beauty to the setting. A late evening in a Montana ranch kitchen with a low-burning lamp and the July heat coming through the window and the sound of one of the children turning over in bed upstairs. Her hand was rough from the garden, and so was his, and neither of them remarked on it. She had found, over the past months, that the things worth having were mostly not the things that announced themselves. Clara found out the next morning because Clara was 13 and had been paying attention for months, and she cornered Adeline in the kitchen garden before anyone else was up. "He asked you," she said. "Yes." "And you said yes." "Yes!" Clara looked at her with those Eleanor sharp eyes. She was quiet for a moment, working through something. "You're not trying to be her," Clara said finally. "Not hostile, genuinely checking." "No," Adeline said. "I couldn't be. And I wouldn't try." She was— Clara stopped. Started again. She was very specific. She knew things about all of us. "I know," Adeline said. "I've been learning. It takes time." "She'd want him to be happy," Claire said, as if completing an argument she'd been having with herself. "She'd want all of us to be." She paused. She was practical like that. "You're practical like that too," Adeline said. Clara considered this. It landed somewhere that mattered. Adeline could see it. Being compared to her mother in a way that was accurate rather than consoling, something earned rather than offered. "Thomas is going to pretend he doesn't care," Clara said, "and then cry about it by himself in the barn." "I know. Lily is going to want to be in the ceremony. I'm planning on it. Robbie won't really understand until it's already happened." "That's fine," Adeline said. "Robbie adapts." Clara nodded slowly. Then she picked up the weeding tool she'd been holding the whole time and got to work on the row Adeline had started, and they worked side by side in the early morning without further conversation, the way they'd been doing since March. Thomas did exactly what Clara predicted. He said he was glad at dinner, in the flat tone of someone who has decided what they're going to say and is delivering it as planned. He went to the barn afterward and stayed for an hour. When he came back, and his eyes were slightly red, and he claimed, without being asked, that he'd had dust in them. "Of course," Adeline said, and gave him the job of cleaning the lamp chimneys, which was his least favorite task, and which she assigned to him specifically because having something to be annoyed about helped him reset, and she'd learned this about him. He cleaned them without complaint. They married in September, at the end of summer when the light in Montana went gold and slanted in a way that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with physics, but was beautiful regardless. It was a small ceremony. A judge from the county seat, a few neighboring families, Mrs. Pell from the South End store, who brought a jar of her preserved apricots as a gift, and which Adeline considered one of the most thoughtful gifts she'd ever received. Prewitt came. He made the trip from his Paper Canyon house in Garrison in a wagon driven by his nephew, his bad hip and all, and sat in the front row with his notary seal in his breast pocket, which he patted once when he saw Adeline looking at him, and which she understood to be a kind of salute. Lily was in the ceremony. Robbie attempted to also be in the ceremony and succeeded in a way that was not planned but that nobody minded. Clara stood next to her father with her chin up and her eyes bright and did not cry, which was exactly what Adeline had expected of her, and which cost the girl something, and was also a measure of how strong she'd become. Wyatt said his words in the steady voice of a man who means what he's saying and doesn't need to ornament it. Adeline said hers the same way. What she thought, standing there, was not about the ceremony. It was about the gate. The half-open gate she'd stood at in March, with nothing in her bag but bread and the specific stubbornness of someone who has been turned away from too many doors to accept another one. She thought about what that woman had been willing to offer. Not a performance of helplessness, not a plea. Just bread. A trade. I have something, you have something. Let's see if we can be useful to each other. And she thought that was the thing. Not the dramatic moment in the assessor's office. Not the ride to Helena in the sleet. Not even the confrontation with Croft on the boardwalk, which she was privately a little proud of. It was that first hour. The decision to offer what she had instead of asking for what she needed. To make herself useful before she made herself necessary. To walk into a stranger's house and treat everyone in it with the respect of her full attention. People talked about courage like it was a thing you had or didn't have. She had found that it was more like a decision you made, repeatedly, in moments that didn't feel significant until later. The decision to knock on one more door. The decision to sit down at a lamplit table and read a stranger's accounts carefully instead of briefly. The decision to ride 60 miles in March sleet because the evidence existed and somebody had to go get it. None of those felt like courage while they were happening. They felt like the only available option for someone who had decided not to stop. The hard truth she'd learned, not from this year, but from the whole of her life, from Daniel's illness and the foreclosure and the 6 weeks of closed doors and everything after, was that survival was not the same as living. Survival was what you did when you were trying to get to the next day. Living was when you decided what the next day was for. She had survived the farm's loss and Daniel's death and 40 miles of walking in March. She had lived the moment she walked through a half-open gate and offered bread she was hungry for herself. The autumn that followed their marriage was the first season at Cross Ridge that felt fully inhabited. Not because things were easier. The accounts were still tight in October. The north pasture fence required another repair after a late storm, and Wyatt threw his back out in November lifting something he should have asked for help with, which led to a week of him being a difficult patient and her being a less patient nurse than she would have liked. She told him this directly, on day 4 of his recovery, when he told her for the 3rd time that he was fine, and she could hear in his voice that he wasn't. "You're a bad patient," she said. "I've been told that before. I'm telling you again, in case repetition helps. It doesn't." "Then be a bad patient quietly," she said. "The children can hear you saying you're fine when you're not, and I'd rather they didn't learn that habit." He looked at her from the pillow. His expression moved through several things. "You're going to say that kind of thing for the rest of our lives, aren't you?" "Yes," she said. "Eleanor did too," he said. "I told you I wasn't easy to live with." "You also said Eleanor was right about things," Adeline said. "I'm choosing to take that as encouragement." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you." "For what specifically?" "All of it," he said. "You know what for." She did know. She didn't make him name it because that wasn't what he needed and she'd gotten better at knowing the difference. By winter, the town of Garrison had largely settled its account with who Adeline Mercer, Adeline Ashcroft now, though she used both names depending on context, which was her right, actually was. The initial wave of opinion had run its predictable course. Some had been skeptical, some had been openly disapproving of a widow who had arrived with nothing and acquired a partnership and a husband within 8 months. A few had been the particular kind of fascinated that turned into grudging respect once the facts were visible. Mrs. Pell had opinions about all of this that she shared with Adeline one afternoon in December, standing at the counter of the South End store while Adeline waited for her order. "You know what they were saying in April," Mrs. Pell said without preamble. "I have a reasonable idea." "Most of it wasn't kind." "It rarely is," Adeline said. "People talk about what they're afraid of. A woman who walks onto a failing ranch and turns it around in 6 months is something some people would prefer not to believe is possible. Because if it's possible, then the things they told themselves about why they didn't do it start to look like excuses," Adeline said, "not reasons." Mrs. Pell looked at her with the dry, measuring expression of a woman who had been underestimated for 40 years and had long since made her peace with it. "You're not wrong," she said. "You've never been particularly wrong, from what I can tell, which is its own kind of problem." "I'm wrong often enough," Adeline said. "I just try to be wrong about things that can be corrected." Mrs. Pell handed over the order. Then she held on to her side of the package for a moment longer. "What you did for that family," she said, not effusively, just plainly. "It mattered." Adeline looked at her. "What they let me do for them mattered," she said. "That's different." And it was different. That was the thing she kept returning to, the thing that refused to reduce itself to a simpler story. She had not saved Cross Ridge Ranch by herself. She had read accounts and ridden to Helena and stood her ground in an upstairs office because those were the things she could do. But what had made any of it possible was the moment Wyatt Ashcroft had opened a door to a dusty stranger and handed her a cup of water. Clara showing her the stove's flue. Thomas trusting her with the ledger. Robbie deciding, with the terrible confidence of a very young child, that she was his. They had let her in. That was the beginning of everything. She thought about this on an evening in late December when the snow had finally come to Cross Ridge in earnest, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and the sounds of the house were the sounds she knew. Clara at the table writing something in the ledger she'd made her own now. Thomas upstairs thumping around in a way that suggested he was engaged in some private project that probably involved rearranging the furniture. Lily singing something to Edmund, who bore it with his customary resignation. Robbie asleep already, his carved horse on the nightstand next to his head. Wyatt was next to her at the stove, closer than was strictly necessary for the task they were both ostensibly involved in, which was figuring out what to do with a pot of beans that had been on since morning and were past saving. His shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away from it. "These beans are done," he said. "They've been done for 2 hours," she said. "We're just both too tired to admit it. We could start over. Or we could eat them anyway and admit that imperfect beans are still beans." He looked in the pot. "They're very imperfect. So are most things that matter," she said. He looked at her sidelong, the way he looked at things he found worth looking at. Outside, the snow was coming down with a Montana seriousness. Not decorative, not seasonal, but a statement of intent that would be there in the morning and probably for several mornings after that. Inside, the kitchen held all its warmth. She had arrived in this kitchen in March with 1 loaf of bread and no particular future she could see clearly. She had not arrived looking for love, which was probably why she'd found it. Love being the kind of thing that appears in the peripheral vision when you're looking at something else. She had been looking at a cold stove and 4 hungry children and a man drowning in his own grief and a set of accounts that told a story nobody had read carefully yet. She had been looking at all of that with everything she had. The rest had followed, imperfectly and irreversibly, the way the best things do. She picked up the ladle. "Imperfect beans," she said. "Imperfect beans," he agreed. And they ate.